critically analyzing global affairs. The Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Oh, well, hello. It's just gone 12 noon in London, 7 a.m. in Philadelphia, and around the world, it's time for the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. And here on the Muckrakers, we pledge to continue tackling the most controversial and pressing news issues of our time. Our mission is to provide more light and less heat in our unwavering quest to uncover the truth and to inform, educate, and entertain, all with dignity and respect. And it's vital, I always say, that we don't just ask the questions, but question those answers. Well, today, the biggest threat we could possibly have, we're going to discuss the imminent potential collapse of Great Britain as a result of its Ukraine and economic policy. And to help me do that, I'm joined by TNT Titan James Friedman and a returner to the show, Alex KRAINER. How are you both, gentlemen?
Very good. Thank you for having us, and good to be with you again.
It's lovely to be back. Very good. And you're Alex, you're in Croatia at the moment. I was just extolling the virtues of Zadar, which is a stunning place. But as a result of all the tourists flooding in, the economy is a bit more challenging for people, isn't it? Things have got more expensive.
Yes, the country has gotten more expensive, unfortunately. But, you know, I think it's pretty universal these days.
No, that's absolutely right. Well, we're going to focus today on Great Britain, or what used to be Great Britain. Not so great these days. It's no longer the United Kingdom, a bit divided. But let me fill you in, first of all, for Alex, who has been on the show before. He's worked as a market analyst, researcher, trader, and hedge fund manager for over 25 years. He's the creator of iSystem Trend Following, publisher of the daily Trend Compass reports covering over 200 financial and commodity markets, and contributing editor of Zero Hedge. He pointed out in his recent piece, The Imminent Collapse of Great Britain, the hints in the title, that through 2024, Ukraine has been pushed to the edge of the abyss, and it's dragging its Western sponsors there. On the 31st of July 2024, Volodymyr Zelensky signed a decree freezing Ukraine's repayment of foreign debts, a de facto default which took effect the next day. The events leading up to this moment and what followed reveals a veritable panic in the leading ranks of the Western financial establishment. Among Western nations, the one that's bet the most aggressively on Ukraine seems to be Great Britain. The consequences will be extreme. Alex, let me start with you then. How did we get here?
I'm not really sure, Andrew. It seems to me that people who are actually in charge are... I don't know another word for it. They're lunatics, and they have been pursuing a number of extraordinarily costly gambles, not just in Ukraine, in the Middle East, the migration, the net zero policies, and all of these projects have multi-billion-dollar price tags, and they're all failing. And they've all put the whole of Britain on the hook for those costs, and we don't even know how much they are. I'll just give you one example. Since in the days since I published my article, Keir Starmer revealed that they found a $22 billion black hole in the British public finances. That same Keir Starmer was haranguing Rishi Sunak back in May of this year in the Parliament, attacking him about the $46 billion pound black hole in British public finances. So which is it? Is it 22 billion, or is it 46 billion, or is it maybe 146 billion? We don't know. But these costs are, and also, you know, we found out that the cost of immigrants to the UK is 8.5 billion pounds a year. Except back in 2016, that estimate was 16.8 billion pounds. So it seems to me that we're being lied to across the board, and every single lie is trying to conceal the actual state of things, which are seemingly much, much worse than what they are being presented to us.
Yeah, you make some valid points. Lies, damn lies and statistics, as Disraeli said. And you're right, the figures are so mind-numbingly enormous that we sort of lose track of what it actually means in practice. James, what's your take on it?
I've got a different view, actually. I don't think, I mean, look, for starters, this whole 22 billion thing wasn't a surprise to Labour. There was no BR report talking about it earlier in the year, which Rachel Reeves had access to. So it's no surprise this amount. But look, 22 billion is not a lot of money for the UK. It's not the kind of money which is going to upset the economy and cause a run on the pound like Labour are trying to pretend. You know, I mean, if you want an example and put it in context, the UK government printed 400 billion 4 years ago to pay for all of the COVID nonsense. So this is small money. I mean, look, I'm no economist. Yes, I know a little bit about economics because I was head of UK trade and also headed up business inflation at the Office for National Statistics. So I know a little bit, but I'm not an expert. But it seems to me that at the moment that the government want to portray the fact that there is a crisis in the UK's finances. I'm not so sure, though, because when you look at all the indicators, so the British pound, for example, is the strongest it's been in many, many years. Inflation has stabilized 2.2% in July. You know, the IMF is predicting that the UK GDP will be one of the highest in the OECD countries this year and next. And, you know, if you look at just in the last week, the demand for gilts, British gilts, is at record high. 110 billion pounds worth of orders were put on bonds that mature in 2040. So I'm not sure. You know, I know that the government is saying that there's a crisis and, you know, the finances, and we're going to have to do this and we're going to have to do that. But it all sounds very, very much like 2010 when the Conservatives came in and said we need a decade of austerity. Did we really need that? I'm not sure we did. I think this is setting the pretext so that the government can do what it's planning to do over the next few years with all of these schemes, net zero and the like, and they're just making way for that. I don't believe that actually the UK finances are in crisis.
So some very interesting points. We always say that there's a narrative here, isn't there? And why are people peddling this fear? As I always quote Edward Bernays, it's the easiest human emotion to sell anything, whether it's a particular narrative or a course of action that the government will take, is fear. So you make people scared, you give them these alarming figures, and as a result of which we're going to take away your winter fuel if you're a pensioner, we're going to increase your taxes and so on and so forth. Talk us through, Alex, because you've got a brilliant piece, and I would urge everybody to go and listen to it and to sign up to your brilliant podcast and various news items that you do. Talk about the recent events in Great Britain, which suggests its financial system nearly collapsed. Talk us through that course of events.
Well, okay, so I was very puzzled about Keir Starmer's extraordinarily draconian crackdown on the riots and clashes that ensued after the 29 July or 28 July stabbing of 29th in Southport. Because, you know, none of these things are not exactly unprecedented events. You know, violent crime has been going up. There's been stabbings, there's been, you know, murders, acid attacks. All of this has been in the media before. And also, you know, the people's resentment against uncontrolled immigration is also not anything new. And so I was wondering, why is this happening and why now? And I've been in the financial services industry for 25 years, and so my initial suspicion was something must be very, very wrong in the financial system. And then I started to look at it, and sure enough, I found a lot of smoke, and I assumed that there's fire before somewhere there. And I understand what James is saying, and I came across similar information. But one thing that I've learned in the financial services is not to believe any official statistics or financial statements or press releases or government statements at all. Last thing that they're ever going to tell us is the truth. The thing that aroused my suspicion is that, first of all, there has been this group of private bondholders who are on the hook for about $20 million with Ukraine, and who have been very keen for Ukraine to start servicing at least the interest on those bonds. And, they gave them a 2-year grace period, and now for some reason they're desperate to start receiving this money. And so there has been negotiations between them and the Ukrainian government between the 12th July and 19th July. Then on the 18th July, Volodymyr Zelensky flies into London and spends 2 days, second day huddling together with Keir Starmer cabinet. He gets the big honor of giving a speech to the cabinet, which hasn't happened since 1997. The last person who has done this was Bill Clinton in 1997. And they conclude their discussions about these bonds, which is $20 billion, not a very large amount. And now it's on Ukraine's government to restructure their debts, to do a swap with the bondholders with a 37% haircut. So the bondholders were supposed to accept new bonds in lieu of the old bonds. And instead of completing this process as agreed, the Ukrainian government, Volodymyr Zelensky, basically declares unilateral default. Nobody's calling it default, but basically he said, we're freezing all servicing of foreign debt for a period of 2 or 3 months. But, these temporary measures tend to be permanent. And so what has happened on the same day as the Ukrainians announcing their deal with bondholders, which was 22 July, is that the Bank of England announced a conference about a new thinking at the Bank of England for the management of the reserves, right? And that they're switching to something called demand-led management of reserves. Now, what does that mean? That means that if I need money to patch up my reserve requirements with the Bank of England, they're just going to give it to me against whatever collateral I have, which could well turn out to be these Ukraine bonds, which means that somebody who's on the hook there is going to be getting 100 cents on the pound, 100 pence on the pound, for bonds that now are worth less than 50 cents
right
on the dollar. I think last I looked, they were at like 46 cents.
Yeah.
And they're going to probably become worthless. And they announced the new program will be a repo program. Now, for anybody who remembers the repo crisis of 2019, the reason why we had this mushrooming repo program was because some bank in the US financial system was actually broke. And if you let the bank go under, it's going to pull other banks together with it, because they all hold exposure to one another's debts and derivatives and so forth. And in the UK particularly, you have a financial system which is not very robust. It doesn't, you don't have thousands of banks and small financial institutions. Basically, 90% of all deposits are with the big five banks. So if one of them fails, there's a risk that the whole system fails overnight. So the Bank of England is preempting this with the repo program. And what they were saying explicitly is that the bank would have to consider a much broader range of collateral to provide liquidity to the system, which means that any kind of toxic sludge in a crisis will be accepted as money good collateral. So to wrap it up and to translate this into plain English is, there's not going to be a bank failure a la Northern Rock or Lehman Brothers. They're going to save the banks by printing money, which means inflation, which will probably be accelerating over the coming years.
Yeah, it is quite extraordinary and exceptionally worrying. I do want to do a deep dive into how we got into this position with Ukraine and the sort of rock star status of Volodymyr Zelensky. But first of all, we're going to take a quick break. Don't touch that dial.
Critically analyzing global affairs, the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, joined by James Freeman and Alex KRAINER. And we're looking at the potential collapse of Great Britain, not least as a result of our economic policies and also our policy in Ukraine. And I was just talking to Alex during the break about what we like to do on the Muckrakers is unpack the jargon, assume that people are not all experts in economics and so on and so forth. And I know, James, you wanted to pick up on a few points.
Yeah, I do, Alex. It's really, really interesting. I did watch your video on Rumble this morning. Really, really interesting. I think some really good points you brought up. Just in terms of my understanding, though, so these bondholders that were basically that Ukraine now is putting off, it's not going to pay the £20 billion. My understanding is they're companies such as BlackRock, PIMCO, Fidelity, all of the big global investment firms that, they've got trillions and trillions on their books. So how does that tie then that liabilities to those global investors to Great Britain? What is the link there?
I'm not sure exactly, but I assume that a lot of the British pension funds have exposure to those bonds and to companies like BlackRock and PIMCO and so forth. So I'm not sure this is still the case, but the British pension funds, in order to generate sufficient returns in this low interest rate environment, have actually taken leveraged positions in various financial instruments that were regarded as safe. So when Kwasi Kwarteng presented his mini budget in September 2023, the market reaction was that the gilts and the British pound sold off, and because they were leveraged, they had to meet margin calls, which they suddenly had, thousands of them. And in order to meet their margin calls, they proceeded to sell off their gilt balances. And so that started on 22nd or 23rd September 2022. By 27th September, so within 5 days, there were no more buyers for long-dated British gilts. And so now there was a risk that the price is going to nosedive, that it's going to just collapse. And so the Bank of England had to step in, and they had to step in with about £40 billion to purchase all these gilts off of British pension funds. And so I think that the exposure is probably pretty widespread, and that even if a pension fund doesn't own directly Ukraine bonds, they might own various other funds held by BlackRock or PIMCO or Amundi or somebody like that, or they might have exposure to gilts. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on sorry, James, just before you move on from that, I promised that we'd cut through the jargon and things like that. And I just, for the sake of everybody listening, can you just explain what gilts and margin calls are?
Okay, so gilts are British government bonds, so the British sovereign debt. And a margin call is basically when you trade, when you have leveraged position in something. Let's say you have $1 million worth of gold on your in your trade book, but you only trade that on a margin, and margin is only a fraction of that full amount. And let's say if you only have 10% of cash on the margin, as soon as your exposure to gold declines by 10%, you lost the whole margin. And so now your trade book is negative. Now you have to provide cash to your broker so that you're in the black. Okay, so that margin is only there to absorb any losses that you might temporarily incur in holding some asset. But the margin has to be positive. You have to always keep the margin requirement as required. As there's always a certain minimum, which in case of bonds will probably be 50%. In case of futures, it might be something between 2 and 10%. But you have to have the cash to meet the margin requirement. And so if you don't have other cash, then you have to go sell some other asset. So in the case of these pension funds, which were completely exposed across the board because they have very difficult time generating sufficient returns to stay viable, they had to sell their gilt positions. And there, the selling pressure suddenly came to a risk of collapsing the whole gilt market, which will have a lot of repercussions because it will spike the interest rate. And, James was saying, during the pandemic days, the Bank of England printed up 400 billion pounds, correct. But the interest rate back then was very close to zero. The interest rate today is 5%. So you have to come up with the cash to service this debt. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, very well explained there, Alex. So basically, you get a downward cycle, don't you, where everyone has to sell off their assets, which brings prices down further, which generates more margin calls when it goes round and round and round again. The other question I've got, Alex, is on the UK government's debt to Ukraine as well, and that was where I was confused because that's what I thought you were talking about. Because of course, there are lots of loans that the World Bank has given Ukraine, which if Ukraine defaults on those, then the UK is actually a backer of that. So I think it works out that if Ukraine stops paying, then it's around 375 million per year that the UK will have to pick up in terms of loan guarantees. So I wasn't sure whether you were talking about that or whether you were talking about the private sort of investors and the links to UK pensions. But I think you explained that very clearly. So thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, very good on that. But let's follow up on that. And in terms of, I did sort of hint at before the break, is that why are we so invested in Ukraine? Bearing in mind that we have, as you say, a cost of living crisis here, pensioners worried about heating or eating, that we have an impending financial crisis here in the UK because of these billions that are disappeared somewhere. We're not quite sure how many billions it is. Why are we so invested in Ukraine, Alex?
I think it goes back to Mackinder's geopolitics, and just to give a reminder to your viewers and listeners, Halford Mackinder was one of the great ideologues of the British Empire at the turn of the 20th century, and he wrote in 1904. He wrote something called Geopolitical Pivot of History. And so, to summarize it, basically his hypothesis was that it was a mistake for the British Empire to focus only on being a maritime empire, and he theorized that there would be a land-based empire that would emerge from the so-called pivot state, and the pivot state would be the area around the Caucasus, North Iran, South Russia, Ukraine, parts of Kazakhstan and Afghanistan. And Mackinder believed that there would be a land empire that would emerge there. Now, at the same time, that this empire would potentially become so powerful that it would become a rival to the British Empire. And so the strategy to prevent this from happening and to maintain the empire's hegemony over the Eurasian landmass, which has been always the central obsession, both of the British Empire and its reincarnation, the American Empire, would be to surround this area with a number of beachheads, meaning where the empire's navies could supply the land armies of countries like France, Italy, India, Korea. That's what Halford Mackinder identified at the time, and where these armies could always pull the Russia, which was identified as the most likely power to emerge as the pivot state and the pivot empire, in these continuous quagmire wars to keep it weak, always, so that it might not emerge as a how do you call it, as a rival. Well, in the meantime, there's been Israel that has been created as another beachhead explicitly for that purpose. And Ukraine as well has been cultivated for this very same reason. So the two things that are very viable there for the empire is not only that it weakens Russia as a rival on the Eurasian landmass, but Russia itself is the world's largest treasure trove of resource wealth, which is estimated between $75 trillion and $90 trillion.
Right.
So if you grab the control of those resources, then those resources can become the collateral for your financial system. And then you get to decide who gets the loans to develop those resources and to turn them into financialized flows through your banking system. And so obviously, the Western Empire would prefer that those be companies like BP and Shell and Halliburton and so forth, and that they fund this development through Western banks. If it's controlled by the Russians or by the Ukrainians or independently, Belarus by Iran and so forth, then it's no good to the Western financial system at all.
Andrew, can I just jump in there?
Yes, please, James.
Yeah, exactly. You absolutely nailed it there, Alex. I totally agree with you in terms of the geopolitics of this. And, in terms of breaking that down further, because you can ask, why is the West giving all these loans to Ukraine? Because Ukraine is never going to be able to pay them back. It's just not. So why is it giving loans? Well, the reason it's giving loans, and this was, I watched a video of RFK Jr., who explained this very, very clearly. It's a great video that's been put out. I think it was actually posted by Trump in the last few days. The reason they give loans is because they can put conditions on those loans. And one of the conditions they put on these loans to Ukraine is that it has to put a lot of its land up for sale. And 30% of Ukraine's land has now been bought by companies such as Monsanto and other Western corporations. So, there is a strategic geopolitical angle to this, of course, but essentially it comes down to greed, Western greed, and Western imperialism over the East and over Eurasia, like you said, Alex. But yeah, it's absolutely it's amazing what's going on when you consider how most people in the West view what's going on. They think that we're coming to the rescue of Ukraine. Everyone's waving their little Ukrainian flags when actually what's really happening is this is daylight robbery. We're going into Ukraine and we're stealing all of their assets while their young men get killed on the battlefield. Quite extraordinary, really.
Well, it's also, a scandalous suggestion. Well, let's unpack that as well, though, James, because you say that they're there and the land's up for sale. Do we have evidence that the land has actually been sold to third parties? What's been sold and to whom?
Oh God, I don't have all of the details here, but if you want to go and look at and do a bit of research, look for that video. It's on X. Like I said, Trump posted it. It's part of their campaign explaining what is going on in Ukraine. If you watch that video and look at other stuff that RFK has done, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm just repeating what he said. But listen, I've got no doubts what he's talking about, and I've heard other experts talking about this as well. It is. And another, the other thing to note here is this is a common tactic of the World Bank. They go into countries, they loan them billions and billions of dollars, and the reason they do that is because they can put all these conditions, like you've got to sell off all of your national assets, whether they're companies, the nationalized companies, you've got to sell them to private investors. If you've got oil, you need to give that up to BP and Shell and all of these other companies. So this is not a new sort of tactic that they're deploying in Ukraine. This is a long-held strategy of institutions like the World Bank.
Yeah, I'm very keen, as I say, we will revisit this. I think the idea, let's set out the facts, because if what the West is doing is actually worse than what Putin was suggesting, just trying to take it, and they're taking it by default, if you like, I think we do need to drill down and look at those specifics. Can you shed any light on that, Alex?
Yeah, of course. I entirely agree with James, and it goes back a very, very long time. But with respect to Ukraine, you can make the case that it was, in fact, the IMF who demanded the anti-terror operation in 2014 after the coup in Ukraine, because as soon as the coup happened, you had very quickly independence movement burgeoning in South and East Ukraine. South and East Ukraine is pretty much half of Ukraine's resource wealth and something like 80 to 90% of its GDP. So when the new government led by Yevgeny Yatsenyuk took over in February of 2014, then you had these independence movements and the resistant movements that risked Western control of East and South Ukraine. So right about April of 2014, the IMF demanded from the Yatsenyuk government to take control of all of Ukraine by force if necessary, or else their IMF loans were in jeopardy. And so there was Jack Lew at the time was a Treasury Secretary in the United States who pretty much informed Christine Lagarde, who was at the time head of the IMF, to demand of the Ukraine government to launch an anti-terror operation and to clean out the resistance movements in the Donbas, in the East Ukraine, and in the South Ukraine. And then this anti-terror operation was launched in April, and then in May we had that massacre in Odessa on the 2nd May, when they killed something like 115 people in Odessa, many of them burnt alive. And you could argue that the imperative strategy to wrest control of Ukraine and the Donbas by force came straight from the IMF. So it's the banking interests that have been at the forefront of deciding the tactics and the strategy of that geopolitical struggle.
Right.
And Andrew,
it is.
I've actually
James,
just
go for it.
while Alex was speaking there, I've actually pulled up this speech. If I just read a couple of paragraphs from it, because I think it does. This is from RFK. So the biggest single asset in Europe in Ukraine is their farmland. There's been 1,000 years wars fought over the land as the richest farmland in the world. It is the breadbasket of Europe. Almost 500,000 Ukrainian kids have died to keep that land part of Ukraine. Talking about historically there, they almost certainly didn't know about this loan conditions, what I was talking about. So they've already sold 30% of it. The buyers were DuPont, Cargill, and Monsanto. And who do you think owns all of these companies? He says, yes, BlackRock. And I think it was in December last year, President Biden gave the contract to rebuild Ukraine. They gave it to BlackRock, and BlackRock have already sold off 30% of the land in Ukraine. So, like I said, what is actually going on, contrary to this, we're coming in to save Ukraine from big, bad, evil Putin, it's a land grab. They're going in there. They've told their citizens they're doing one thing. So because I think Western citizens would not support what is going on if they knew the truth. And by the way, Andrew, we've talked a lot about free speech on this program and why the clampdown is happening at the moment. It is because of this. Because Western governments do not want their citizens learning about the truth about what is going on in Ukraine, because they will put a stop to it straight away. So that is why they're clamping down on free speech. It's nothing to do with paedophiles and all this kind of nonsense which they're talking about. It is to preserve and keep the truth concealed about what they're doing here, which is essentially daylight robbery.
Yeah, and that's the headline, isn't it? And as you say, nobody in the media, other than those on TNT and RFK Jr., is sort of highlighting this point, which is why free speech, we need to have it. People need to know what's really going on. It is a land grab. People say that Putin's the big bad wolf. Well, actually, the big bad wolf seem to be the people who are holding out these loans in order to grab that land. It's a shocking revelation. We're going to do a deeper dive into all of this straight after these messages.
From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers. Me, Andrew Eborn, joined by the wonderful Alex KRAINER yet again, and also TNT Titan James Freeman. And we've just been looking at the decline, if you like, the imminent potential collapse even of Great Britain, and the shocking revelation about the real reasons for us assisting Ukraine, which is effectively a land grab, which nobody in the media is talking about. And we touched on earlier about the lessons, if you like, that can be learnt from the decline of other former imperial powers. You touch on this in all the time, Alex. Tell me about those. What are the parallels? What are the lessons that should be learnt and what we're not learning at the moment here in Great Britain?
Well, we should first keep in mind that every empire in history collapsed. That's it. Empires collapse. So this imperial system of governance that relies on colonies and exploits them is unsustainable, and it's very obvious that it's unsustainable because it has a massive cost to the imperial nation, whereas the benefits from colonies and from the empire only accrue to a very, very small set of vested interests who are invariably the moneylender vested interests. And so I'll read you a quote written by Cicero, because we're always talking about this nexus of East and West, the Eastern Mediterraneans that has for millennia been the hub of trade between the East and West, and has as a consequence been very influential and very wealthy. And so it was extremely important to the Romans as well, meaning, Judea, Greece, and Asia Minor. So here's what Cicero wrote about this in 66 BC, okay? So he says, if some lose their whole fortunes, they will drag many more down with them. Believe me, that the whole system of credit and finance, which is carried on here in the Forum, is inextricably bound up with the revenues of the Asiatic province, meaning Asia Minor.
Yes.
The revenues of the if those revenues are destroyed, our whole system of credit will come down with a crash. And so now, this was 2,090 years ago that he wrote that, and if you substitute the financial transactions carried on in the Forum with financial transactions carried on in the City of London and on Wall Street, and if you substitute Asia Minor for Middle East in general, you get the same thing. It's always about the collateral. It's always about the financial inverted financial pyramid that sits on top of that collateral, and the fact that if you lose control of that collateral, that whole inverted pyramid collapses as like a house of cards. And so this is this is where the empire is unsustainable. This is why this empire is going to collapse as well. And I think that, in spite of the fact that most people today were led to believe that the British Empire is no more, the vested interests that were, the beneficiaries of British Empire have simply switched hosts. They didn't go away. The same system today is what gave rise to the American Empire, and the same interests and the same obsessions are driving policy today. It's not about the British people. It's not about the American people. These vested interests don't care if every last pensioner froze to death this winter. They just don't care. What they want is control of the natural wealth of the Eurasian landmass. And in order for them to control that natural wealth, they have to eliminate any rival who might assert that control instead. And primarily today, we're talking about Russia and China. And so the war in Ukraine is being waged in order to weaken Russia so that it might be regime changed and so that it might be partitioned so that its $75 billion worth of resource wealth could be taken over.
Right. So if that, going back to the point about the land grab and taking over the resources and so on and so forth, I mean, as a key supporter of Ukraine against Russia, if I look at the figures, I think the UK has invested at least 7.5 billion in military aid, and I think about 5 billion in financial support. You're saying that, and RFK Jr. is also saying, as James quoted, that actually this is about a land grab and about resources and so on and so forth. Are we going to see the benefit then, or is it going to be third parties who's going to see that benefit? Alex?
I regret, but the line was breaking out and I couldn't hear the...
I was asking, sorry, I thought there was that momentary pause. I was talking about the amount we've invested, which is about 7.5 billion military aid, 5 billion financial support. I was pointing out that we talked about this being a land grab. That's the real reason RFK and Junior is maintaining that this is happening. We've got evidence of that, and James has quoted about the companies. To what extent does the United Kingdom benefit from that, Alex? I think we might have lost you again. James, can you help us on this? How does the UK benefit?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert on this, but look, the UK, the US, all of NATO countries, it's all part of the same financial system, isn't it, of the West? So, I think UK corporations such as Shell, BP, and these companies and other corporations in the UK, the UK will benefit that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that citizens of the UK will benefit from this. A lot of this money doesn't trickle down to us plebs via these corporations. So I don't think we should expect to see benefits for us. But look, I agree with Alex that the US empire is coming down as we speak. And the irony in all of this, actually, Alex, and I know you'll agree with me on this, is this push to control and cajole Russia has actually had the opposite effect of what the US interests are. For example, the US confiscated 400 billion in Russian US reserves on the SWIFT system. And the effect that has had on the world has been everybody, all other countries, that even allies of the UK have sat up and gone, what? So the US, if it wants now, it can just steal other countries' foreign reserves. And the effect that had is it's pushed Russia into the hands of China. It is solidified and reinforced the BRICS movement, and also put, I think, to the top of the agenda of the BRICS movement, the de-dollarization of the world economy, which is going to come back to bite America in the arse, because that is the reason America is a superpower, because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. And, all of these BRICS countries, I think they're more than 50% of global GDP now, and the club of the BRICS countries is getting bigger and bigger, as time goes on. I think this is the catalyst that Alex was talking about that will actually bring down the US financial system, and along with it, the financial system in the West as well.
Alex, do you want to come back on that?
Well, yes. Unfortunately, Andrew, I didn't hear your question because I had some connectivity issues and it cut out.
Yeah, so what I was mentioning just beforehand, I was asking James to sort of on his sort of thing about the investment. I was pointing out some of the figures about 7.5 billion in military aid that the UK's given and the 5 billion in financial support. I'm working out that we're on this impending financial crisis we've got in the UK. Suggestion of and a resort ramp, to what extent would the UK health actually benefit, and in what sort of time frame?
Whether the people of the UK will benefit.
Yeah, the
Yes.
question was, because you did cut up a bit there, Andrew. So, Alex, what Andrew was saying is, what will the benefits be to the UK? Because obviously it's putting a lot of chips on this land grab in Ukraine. So how will this benefit the UK? Why is it doing this?
Oh, it's not going to be of any benefit to the ordinary British citizen at all. The system is designed that way. I mean, for centuries, this imperial system of governance has always been constant in two ways. It's been very good at generating crises in the domestic economy, and it has been very good at generating permanent warfare abroad. And so, the British people will be called on to fight wars for the benefit of imperial masters, for the imperial oligarchy. So there might be conscription, there might be a savage austerity at home, and they will probably be living in a crisis of stagflation for an extended period of time, which will really lower the standards of living in Britain for most people by far. And the benefits, if any, will accrue to the same imperial oligarchy that's been ruling Britain probably since 1688, since the Glorious Revolution. There's been some turnover there, but my understanding is it's a handful of families who all know each other very well, who are benefiting from this system. And they might continue to benefit up until maybe people have had enough and they do like the French and whip out the guillotines and shorten them all by a head.
Yeah, Alex, and actually, when I was looking at the this negotiations over this 20 billion with BlackRock and others, guess which family it was that was holding those negotiations? It was the Rothschilds.
Oh, I know. It's amazing how certain names always crop up wherever the land is drenched in blood. It's uncanny because, I could think of many financial institutions that could have done a good job as an advisor, but it's always that one. It's amazing. It's really, truly amazing.
Just a coincidence, though, isn't it, Alex?
Well, I think the important thing is, it's really good to ask the questions. I'm always conscious of defamation laws and TNT's pockets and insurance and so on and so forth. They're not here to defend themselves. But you mentioned families, and again, I'm always going back to evidence. Which are the families that you're suggesting and why?
Well, I think the one that we mentioned is probably part of it, if not the lead. But then, my understanding is that there's a lot of these generations-old land-owning families whose names I don't know off the top of my head. But if I consulted my notes, I would probably find about half a dozen of them.
Right. I think it's always very important, as I say, what I like about this show is we present the evidence, and we'll get you back. Let's unpack that properly. But it's a very serious accusation and a defamatory one, which we need to back up with evidence and obviously try and get somebody to speak about it.
All we're saying is that the Rothschilds are involved in these negotiations. I don't think we were saying anything else.
Okay.
But their name does seem to pop up when these discussions about these kind of things around the world go on. That's all we were saying.
Yeah, and I think, as I say, our only quest, we're not coming from any particular prejudice or other side, is the only quest is for the truth, which is why we're so keen to unpack this. Now, I'm very keen in the last few minutes available to us to talk about freedom of speech. Tomorrow, I'm delighted we've got Errol Musk, the father of Elon, is returning, as he will do every week on the Muckrakers. And the worrying time, as we started at the beginning of this, about people being shut down from talking about these issues, complying obviously with defamation laws and so on and so forth. James, you wanted to make a point on this because you've got your guest coming up on your show straight after this. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I've got a great guest in the next hour on the Freeman Report. Dr. Simon Godek is coming on. The reason he's relevant to free speech because he fled the Netherlands during the COVID period because the government there was coming down on him because of his speech around COVID. Well, He's living in Brazil now. He lives in the jungle. And of course, the Brazilian courts there have banned X. They forced Elon Musk to cancel X. Well, he's obviously using a VPN. He's still tweeting away. So he's going to come on my show live in a moment to talk all about that and what is going on in Brazil.
It is a fascinating position at the moment. I mean, freedom of speech is a fundamental right, and never has that been a more sort of threatened position. It's on life support. What's your take on that, Alex?
Well, I think it's everything, because without the freedom of speech, we lose our sense of orientation, we lose our sense of perspective, we lose the truth, and without the truth, we can't move forward. I think that, maybe perhaps Mohandas Gandhi said it best. He said, there is no God higher than truth, and that we have to defend and investigate and learn in order to pass it on to others. And everybody who learns the truth must speak it out.
And that's certainly what we try to do on this thing. In the last 30 seconds, then, I mean, it's all very depressing hearing all of this. And I say, as you unpack it and get to as close as we can to the truth, what can people do, Alex?
Speak out, learn, study, question, speak to your neighbors, speak to your friends, share information and knowledge with everybody you can, understand our place in history, understand the precedents from the past, and try to reach the real understanding, not the comforting narratives that we've been fed since our school days, but which are ultimately untrue or distorted by just so much that we miss the really important lessons of history.
And can I just jump in? Support TNT and support other platforms like X, which are the platforms of free speech, but definitely support TNT and watch us.
Absolutely. Free speech is not free. We need contributions to help us stay on the air. Basically, tomorrow, Elon Musk will be joining me yet again. We're going to unpack lots of things that are going on with his son, the implications about Brazil, and various erosions of freedom of speech. Thank you again to Alex. Thank you to James. And thank you for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.
If you missed this hour, simply go to episodes at tntradio.live